So now we're going to go ahead and start into Module 5 here. And as we just went over in the last few modules about the various types of drugs and disorders, we're going to focus on how we go ahead and diagnose substance abuse, and specifically looking at alcoholism, knowing that a lot of the characteristics of alcoholism is going to be consistent with dependency in some of the other areas that we're talking about, the various other drugs that we reviewed. And so with diagnosis, one of the things that we need to know is that the public attitude towards things like alcohol consumption changed dramatically during the course of U.S. history, where a lot of our original economy back in colonial days for the federal government was based on taxes on alcohol. And so we had a very strong affinity towards alcohol from the very beginning of our country. But that soon began to wane. And in the late 1900s, what you saw, or late 1800s, early 1900s, was a movement away from alcohol because of the devastating effects of alcoholism had on families, which led rise eventually to prohibition in the 1920s. And then eventually it's repealed because people realized they liked their alcohol and would like to keep it around. So the picture on the left there is just kind of a bar scene from the probably 1930s, 1940s. And you can see that, of course, it was a big social gathering kind of place. And the alcohol consumption there was considered part of the social lubricant for our society. Now, the DSM-5 has a classification of two main categories of substance use disorders. You have substance use disorder. In this case, someone is addicted to a drug, whereas substance-induced disorders is the immediate impact of taking a drug, such as in being intoxicated, or discontinuing its repeated use, such as withdrawal, which is what we talked about in one of our earlier modules for this chapter. So as far as diagnosis, and specifically in regards to alcohol, it's going to fall into some of these broader categories. You do need two of the total features, but some of these categories have multiple symptoms attached to them. So you can see the first is an impaired control over the use of alcohol. So you have lost your ability to control your usage and feel impelled to use it. Probably have a craving, and we talked about cravings earlier. Social impairment that follows problematic drinking. So not surprising here, this is going to have the negative impact that we talked about throughout the last few modules and really throughout our semester in regards to criteria. That impact on socialization is a key indicator for an awful lot of the disorders that we talked about. Obviously, not all of them, but for quite a few. The risky use, so people will go out of their way and put themselves or others in danger in order to be able to use. And then the pharmacological criteria, which goes back to the tolerance and withdrawal that we talked about in the earlier modules. The course and outcome, some of the things we'll be talking about is that it's fairly unpredictable in regards to alcoholism. As far as the DSM-5, it really does emphasize the recurrent and maladaptive pattern, and when we get into. So, there can be some of these characteristics in individuals who are not necessarily have alcohol use disorder because they aren't something that occurs over a great period of time. So remember, there's always a durational aspect when we get into official diagnoses. As far as the course and outcome, you can see the course, age of onset, time progression. It's all going to vary widely. We can't say if you start using, then you all of a sudden within 3 months will have this, and then 6 months have that. It's really dependent on the individual and how that manifests over time. A lot of times periods of heavy use tend to alternate with periods of relative abstinence. So especially for those initially using alcohol and starting to get further in depth in that, they may go through these kind of waxing and waning of alcoholic binges, but it's not constant. There are several comorbidities. Remember, these are disorders that co-occur with alcoholism. You can see there antisocial personality disorder, which we talked about in previous chapters, as we have with some of these others, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, conduct disorder, which we'll be talking about in some future chapters, particularly in adolescence. And particularly with antisocial personality disorder and alcohol or drug dependency, the reason they frequently co-occur is that they represent alternative manifestations of general predispositions towards behavioral disinhibition. Now, that was an awful lot of long-sounding words, but basically what this means is that when you are disinhibited, you could have more impulsive kind of activities. Now, what you usually see there is with impulsiveness and kind of antisocial personality disorder, you're going to see the tendency to want to drink. As far as the mood and anxiety disorders, the reason there is probably more of a maladaptive coping mechanism where people are overwhelmed with their situation. And so therefore, they tend to drink as a way of kind of dismissing their concerns and hopefully minimizing them to a certain degree. So let's talk about the frequency of these substance use disorders. And one of the big things I think that we need to realize is that drugs are a cultural phenomenon. The way our culture influences what we use as drugs. So you go to different areas of the world, and there are going to be different drugs that are more problematic and favored, and the way that they're taken in too. So you can see opium is used quite heavily in Southeast Asia and Middle Eastern countries, whereas cocaine is used in South America and, of course, imported here into North America. Cannabis tends to be spread pretty worldwide, and amphetamines are used very heavily in Japan. And not all substance use, of course, is related to addiction. And just to kind of show you how culturally dependent some of these drugs are and how that can divorce itself from usage, there was a cautionary tale out of Vietnam when we were in the Vietnam War, where a lot of our veterans got hooked on opium and heroin when they were in Vietnam. And they were worried that all the soldiers, when they returned, would have this huge issue with heroin addiction. And what they found is that it didn't happen. So the heroin, once they were back in a different culture and environment that did not really value the use of heroin and it was not normalized, tended to help people get over it. I'm not saying that there weren't some that didn't have addiction, but it does go to the underlying point that culture really does have an influence in the way that we use our drugs. You could even look at alcohol for that matter. In our society, we have a mixed record with alcohol, and we also have a limit at 21. So if you're under 21, the tendency is drink as much as you can when it's available. So we have a real high incidence here in the United States with binge drinking, whereas if you go over to a place like England or France or Italy, you would see that the drinking for adolescents, it tends to be more in moderation and done more socially. And it's also done between generations, whereas here, people usually drink with people their own age, especially if you're teenagers or in your early adulthood, and it's not viewed as a multi-generational activity. And so you have very different uses of patterns of use in regards to all that. Now, most people who use alcohol or drugs are not going to become dependent upon them. I think it's an important point to make. However, the age of your initial use is a risk factor. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the big ones, and we've talked about this previously, and then in my adolescence class, we go over this a lot because the brain in adolescence is still forming. It even goes through its second great brain growth spurt in puberty, and new connections are being formed. And so with all this new capability, experience plays a big role in shaping the way that the brain prunes its various connections to make it more efficient. And if drugs are introduced during that time period, it's going to adapt to those drugs much quicker than you would see in an adult. What this means from what we're talking about is that the level of addiction is much more likely because the brain starts ramping back those neurotransmitters that I was talking about earlier. And you can see there the incidence of alcoholism for adolescents who began at the age of 14 is over 2 times that amount versus those who begin at 18, which I imagine is still a little bit higher than those who start at 21, which is, of course, the legal drinking age. So the next slide here is just the frequency of substance use disorders, where we have abuse versus dependence, and the lifetime prevalence. You can see, not surprisingly, of the drugs there, that cannabis or marijuana is the highest, probably going to increase due to the movement in our country with more recreational usage. And you can see the rest of them a little bit further behind. Cocaine, amphetamines, opioids. I have to look at how old this particular figure is, because I would think opioids might be a bit higher. But this just kind of gives you an idea. What they say is the combined lifetime prevalence for abuse or dependence of any type on a controlled substance, which all these would be, is about 10.3%. And of course, the lifetime prevalence here, people don't necessarily just abuse a drug. A lot of times they can abuse more than one drug. So that's why if you add all that up in that survey there, it's going to be more than 10, obviously. But it's about 10%. And then as far as gender differences, what we see is that drug abuse and dependence is significantly more common among men than women. And you can see that right there. This is substance use disorders and the age of those who have it. And you can see that early to mid-adulthood, that 20 to 35 range, is a much higher risk factor in regards to having symptoms of substance use disorder. And then as you go down, the risk decreases quite a bit. So that's going to end this module. In Module 6, we're going to talk about various causes of substance addiction and get a little more into the details there. So tune in for the next module.